Okay, so yes, a very warm welcome to you to this Sangha night, on which I will be continuing the theme that we've started on, the theme of living the Dharma life. And I suppose I'll tackle this theme in my own way. Yes, so we won't be hearing from Shanti Prabha, I'm afraid. So what I wanted to talk about really is, how do we know if we're living the Dharma life? There's a question, isn't it? Let's say we aspire to live a Dharma life. How do we know if we are actually doing it? What does it look like? How can we tell? So maybe we think living a Dharma life is about having particular Dharmic beliefs, or having a particular feeling for the Buddha. Or maybe it's more about what we do. Maybe it's more about, for example, having a regular meditation practice, or practicing the precepts. Or maybe it's more a matter of feeling. Maybe it's about feeling that you're a Buddhist, or it's about having a sense of devotion and worship for the Buddha or a particular bodhisattva. So I think it's worth wondering about this question for yourself. How do you know if you're living a Dharma life? How do you know if you're a Buddhist? That's one way of putting it. And in Triratna we have quite a nice, easy, even pat answer to that question, which I hope you've come across. It is a question that Sangha that Bhante has answered for us already, and he's made it very clear that being a Buddhist, that living a Dharma life is about going for refuge to the three jewels. Going for refuge to the three jewels, to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. And this can all sound a little bit, it can trip off the tongue a bit quickly, can't it? It's actually quite an unusual answer in the Buddhist world. I don't know how many Buddhists around the world would give that as an answer. I suspect it's not that many. So that this particular way of thinking about the centrality of going for refuge, this is something that is not unique, but fairly unusual to Sangha. And if you want to read more about it, you can read this book called, I don't know if you can see that, The History of My Going for Refuge by Sangha, which is an autobiographical arc of how Sangha's own understanding of going for refuge to the three jewels deepens and deepens throughout his Dharma career. So I'd recommend that. It's especially important if you have asked for ordination, but even if you're a mitra or thinking of becoming a mitra, it's a useful, there's a lot in there. It's quite a slim book, but there's a lot in there. So what I'd like to do in this session is try and unpack this language of going for refuge to the three jewels, and in particular, try to relate to the experience of it. What does the experience of going for refuge to the three jewels, what's that like? So, first of all, we probably have to address the whole language, don't we? It's rather strange language. It doesn't sound particularly heroic, does it, going for refuge? But let's go back to the source. So this is the Buddha speaking in the Dhammapada, which is a text of the Buddha's aphorisms, if you like. So in the Dhammapada, verse 188, if you're interested in checking it out, the Buddha says, "Many people, out of fear, flee for refuge to sacred hills, woods, groves, trees, and shrines. In reality, this is not a safe refuge. In reality, this is not the best refuge. Fleeing to such a refuge, one is not released from all suffering. One who goes for refuge to the enlightened one, to the truth, and to the spiritual community, and who sees with perfect wisdom the Four Noble Truths, for them, this is a safe refuge. For them, this is the best refuge. Having gone to such a refuge, one is released from all suffering. So this is the kind of the locus classicus, as I say, the sort of the classic, where the Buddha sort of speaks about going for refuge in the most pithy kind of way. So we're talking about refuge. What is a refuge? Sarana is the Pali word, sarana. So you might recognize that from Saranang Gacchami that we just chanted. Buddhang Saranang Gacchami. To the Buddha, Buddhang Saranang, for refuge. Gacchami, I go. Gacchami is an intensive word. It's got a sort of an intensifier in it. So it's a very definite I go for refuge to the Buddha. Dhammang Saranang Gacchami, Sanghang Saranang Gacchami. So sarana is a refuge, it's a shelter, it's a protection. So what are we taking refuge from? So in the text, the Buddha gives the kind of the whole picture in terms of we're going for refuge from suffering. That's his project. We're going for refuge from suffering. I think we can break this down in a few ways. There's physical refuge. We are vulnerable beings. We're soft, fleshly, vulnerable beings. And we need shelter, and we need food, and we need security. So these days we probably don't go for refuge to sacred hills and shrines, but we've got our own version. We have to unpack what our own versions are. So of course we need houses, we need food, we need a basic level of security, and for all that we need money. Money does a fairly good job of getting all the rest of our physical needs met. But we're also primates, and primates have a very strong need for social connection and social acceptance, and to form attachments to significant others, and for intimacy. So that's another whole level of need that we have. And I think we're also taking refuge from something more particularly human, which I will call existential anxiety. So this language comes from the existentialists, and it's describing a mood, you could say, a mood which comes from finding ourselves in this uncanny situation of being alive. We didn't ask to be born, and we know we're going to die, and we probably aren't asking to die. And so we've got this span in between without an instruction manual, and we're just trying to kind of cobbling together what to do with this time. And we're sort of trying to find ways of making it all meaningful and significant. So we're taking refuge also from something quite existential, which we could call existential anxiety, this kind of slight edgy mood of not quite being sure what we're all about. So quite naturally, we go for refuge to two things. We go for refuge to a variety of different things. We go for refuge to those kinds of things that give us a sense of security. So shelter and money and food and all the rest of it. So very basic material refuges. We go for refuge to relationships, human relationships. We also go for refuge to activities which address, to one way or another, this existential anxiety. So there might be things, activities, interests that feel worthwhile, meaningful, could be altruistic activity, could be ways of developing ourselves, could be all manner of different hobbies and interests. But also slightly less effectively, we can numb out the existential anxiety just through busyness, through all manner of ways of zoning out, of drugs and alcohol and the internet and social media and all the rest of it. I don't have to unpack all that, I'm sure. So we've got all sorts of different strategies to feel okay about ourselves. We're looking for a basic sense of okayness and security. And we do that by going for refuge to a whole assortment of different things. And the Buddha is telling us that these kinds of things that we're going for refuge to, they're not a safe refuge and they're not the best refuge. So some of them are pretty effective, aren't they? Sort of houses and jobs and all the rest of it. They do a fairly good job. And some of them are clearly not very good at all. Various addictive behaviours and ways of numbing out, they're not the best of refuges, really. But none of the traditional refuges that we have are safe, ultimately safe, because they're all conditioned. So our houses are conditioned, our jobs are conditioned, our money is conditioned, our relationships are conditioned. And because they're conditioned, they can all dissolve. The conditions that support them can dissolve and we'll be left without them. So the Buddha is telling us that the three jewels are the best refuges and the safest refuges. They're the best because they provide ultimate security, they remove suffering, and they're the safest because they are unconditioned. Now, there's a whole talk in trying to justify those two statements, that the three jewels are the best and the safest refuges, but I'm not going to give that talk, because what I want us to do is to try to get a feeling for what those refuges feel like, what the three jewels feel like. In other words, get a feeling for how we know if we're living a Dharma life. So I shall move on. So a question is, how do we know where we are going for refuge? How do we know to what we are going for refuge? Whether it's the three jewels or false refuges. So I'll highlight a few different ways of telling. And I'm sure you've got your own version, that the longer that you've been practicing, the clearer this will be in your mind. I think the best way of telling is the most painful. The best way of telling what our refuges really are is when the going gets tough, when the proverbial hits the fan. So this is another way of saying when our conditioned refuges dissolve. So, and for myself, I've got I can sort of feel, I can sense one refuge is having a basic level of good health. And it's been a very long time since that was threatened, and I can sort of feel myself resting on laurels there. But yeah, once I did have a cancer scare, and it was very interesting to see what happened there. I've told that story elsewhere, so I don't think I'll tell it tonight. But anyway, that's one example of a conditioned refuge dissolving or being threatened with dissolution. It could be your own health, it could be a loved one's health, it could be your own life or a loved one's life that is suddenly threatened. So what happens? Where do you find refuge at times like that? If you lose your job, what happens? If you lose your home, what happens? And then, of course, you can have several of those things happening all at once. This is when people really get crushed, isn't it? When refuges start being pulled away from them on all sides, when their props are taken away at all sides. And I once went on a year-long retreat with some friends. There's 5 of us. And what I found interesting about that experience is that so many of our props were taken away. We had shelter, we had food, we had fantastic conditions in many ways, but we were taken out of our usual relationships, out of our usual roles, out of our usual way of killing time and entertaining ourselves and just making ourselves feel okay. Just being able to go shopping and buy something or watch a video or whatever it is, all those little ways of feeling okay. Even being able to buy our own food. And it was very interesting to see this kind of raw edge emerging for all of us. Bits of irritability, bits of it came out in all sorts of interesting ways, a sort of a basic level of threat, I think, which meant that we all got a little bit cranky around food, for example, which I found interesting. So, yes, when the going gets tough, what happens? Do we try to distract ourselves? Do we blame others? Do we feel like a victim? Do we go into poor me? Do we take responsibility for ourselves, for our own situation or not? So yes, there's a basic sort of perspective which we can take on the experience of our refuges dissolving, which is very kind of revealing, really. And I thought I'll read you a story. This is a story told about a woman called Deepa Ma, who was an Indian practitioner, a very, very impressive practitioner who died, I'm not quite sure, maybe 20 years ago, so a fairly recent practitioner. And she lived in the slums of Calcutta, and she had some children, and she lived a very, very basic life. But she ended up being an extraordinary teacher, and she was especially known for her love, for the way that she could completely overwhelm people with her love for them. But this story doesn't sound very loving. This is a story that's told by one of her students who was a teacher. So Deepa Ma trained her up to be a teacher. And she tells this story. She says, this is Sudipti Barua. She says, when my son died in 1984, Deepa Ma shocked me with her words. It was a hard teaching I have not forgotten. She said, today your son has gone from this world. Why are you shocked? Everything is impermanent. Your life is impermanent. Your husband is impermanent. Your son is impermanent. Your daughter is impermanent. Your money is impermanent. Your building is impermanent. Everything is impermanent. There is nothing that is permanent. When you are alive, you might think, this is my daughter, this is my husband, this is my property, this is my building, this car belongs to me. But when you are dead, nothing is yours. Sudipti, you think that you are a serious meditator, but you must really learn that everything is impermanent. So she was not sentimental. I think we could say that. And this is not a teaching I would advise you to give to any of your friends or loved ones who have been recently bereaved. But I give that as an example of the radical perspective that the Dharma gives. It's a completely unsentimental perspective and completely realistic. So I said that's probably the best way of finding out where our refuges are. I mean, probably the best way is when we're actually on our deathbed, and then we'll see where we're at. It's easy to fool ourselves until then, I think. But I don't wish any of that on you, so let's look at a few other ways of telling. So one obvious way of telling is just how consistent we are in our Dharma practice, just how consistent we are in our ethical practice, how scrupulous we are in our ethical practice. That's in a way where the rubber hits the road, isn't it, in our ethical practice. And of course there's our meditation practice. How much do we prioritize our meditation practice? And reflection and the way that we study the Dharma, to what extent does Dharma study form a significant part of our input, if you like, and to what extent is it a sort of fringe activity around crime novels and all sorts of box sets on TV. Another thing we can look at is, if you like, a milder version of when the going gets tough. It's how do we deal with the worldly winds? So there's a whole set of talks on the worldly winds on our YouTube channel, which we gave right back at the beginning of the pandemic. We thought this was quite an appropriate teaching for the time. So the worldly winds, those forces in the world, those inevitable forces in the world that tend to blow strongly on our false refuges. So gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and infamy. What's the other one? Gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and infamy, and did I say praise and blame? I forget. There's those four pairs. So do we get blown about by the worldly winds? Do we get into intoxication, or the opposite? What's detoxification? Do we get all intoxicated with the way the world's going for us, or do we get overwhelmed by the way the world's going for us? Or do we get completely lost in stories? Or do we simply just recognize what's happening? Oh yeah, that's it. This is me being blamed. This is me getting a bad name for myself. Or this is me being praised. This is me winning the lottery, whatever it is. So the worldly winds are another good indicator. Another indicator is, what are your reference points for your ethics and your sense of values? Are they basically the ones given to us by society, or have they been more transformed by the Dharma? So I've got a recollection of, well, basically I'm pretty socially awkward when there's more than two of us, basically. I don't like groups where it's all a bit kind of free form and, dinner table kind of situations, if I can't grab people to myself. And I remember sitting down at a dinner table once with a bunch of people I didn't know very well. And I was just feeling a bit awkward and a bit inadequate and thinking, how do I connect with people here, and how do I not feel like an idiot? And then I realized, actually, this isn't an ethical issue. Whether I'm comfortable in social situations, whether I'm able to make small talk or not, is not an ethical issue. I don't have to be good at this. And there's quite a sense of freedom that came with that, quite a sense of relief. It kind of freed me to just kind of be happy to be quiet or be happy to be talking, and not feel under some sort of pressure to be a particular way. And of course, there's the whole area of what constitutes natural ethics and what constitutes conventional morality. I hope that you've done enough Dharma study to know the difference between those, or starting to get a feel for the difference between what Buddhism would call natural ethics, and in distinction to conventional morality, the kind of things that are felt to be true and right with the society around us, but which actually don't conform to dharmic values. Okay, a few more clues. Where does your time get spent? Where does your money get spent? Where does your energy go? So these are clues of what might be your refuges. What are, if you like, your bottom line commitments? What's the, if all else went, what wouldn't you give up in your life? So these are just a few clues. They're not kind of foolproof, but they're indications. Okay, at a more mental level, where does your mind go in quiet moments? When you're in sort of, when there's no other demands on you, what do you do with your mind? And of course, meditation is a very good example of a quiet moment, isn't it? Where does your mind tend to go in meditation? If it's anything like mine, it thinks there's more important things to be done than just sit here. And if I'm not careful, it just goes off into planning the next important thing that has to be done. So does it sort of, does it want to go off into doing and if you like, sort of losing yourself in activity again, in the sort of mental activity. So those are just a few clues. Ultimately, going for refuge is about where we find our footing in life, where we find our security in life. And it can be a little bit hard to know that until, as I say, the going gets tough. And deepening our level of going for refuge, I think of it as a little bit like kind of moving our weight. It's like if we got our weight, it's like if we initially were sort of standing on one leg, that one leg being the false refuges, to use that Buddhist language, and then we sort of start becoming a Buddhist, and we start to kind of put a little bit of weight on the other foot, on the three jewels. We sort of try out putting a bit of weight on the three jewels, and we realize, oh yeah, we'll take a bit of weight, yeah, put a bit more on there, put a bit more on there, put a bit more on there. And as we do that, we can start to remove some of the weight from the other refuges. And what that actually looks like will be very different for different people. So, for example, to begin with, it might be that a lot of that weight is on our family. You know, we might have children. And in order to sustain our children, we have to work and we have to have a home. And so outwardly, we've got home, job, children, family activities, earning money. And when we start to go for refuge to the three jewels more, that might look very, very similar, because unlike Siddhartha, you don't necessarily have to leave your home and family in order to go for refuge more fully. He didn't have the luxury of knowing how to do that. But at a more sort of emotional, even existential level, our weight of security is being withdrawn from home, family, job, security, money, and so on, and is being put in the three jewels, which doesn't actually make one a bad worker necessarily or a bad parent. It probably makes us a better one, because we're not so anxiously attached, we're not so anxiously fearful about losing those things anymore. So the externals may well change. You know, we may decide to change job, we may decide to do all sorts of different things externally, but it's the internal experience which is, in a way, more significant. Giving up our mental refuges is harder, in a way, than our physical refuges. And one way it can look is that there's a kind of a basic increasing level of fundamental okayness. We no longer need to keep on bolstering our sense of okayness by stoking it constantly with other people's acceptance, by being useful, by being successful and achieving things. It's like we're withdrawing our sense of okayness. We're withdrawing that dependence from the external world. We're even withdrawing it from our own, in a way, from our own internal critic. We're no longer dependent on some conditioned sense of ourselves. I'm okay because I meditated this morning, or I'm okay because I'm basically a sort of decent meditation practitioner, or whatever it is. Even that level of conditioned okayness gets withdrawn. It's like we're finding something deeper than that. It's unconditioned, a deeper level of unconditioned okayness. It's a little bit like an unconditioned first stage of the metta bhavana, where we no longer have to think, may I be well by by doing these things, or by living up to my expectations for myself. There's something deeper. We're standing on the three jewels. We're standing on something that's beyond our psychology. So I want to wrap up soon, but I just wanted to try and sketch out something of what it might look like over time. Because going for refuge isn't a once and for all moment. It's something that deepens. This is one of Sangha's understandings. In a lot of traditional Buddhism, going for refuge is maybe a little bit like the equivalent of our mitra ceremony. It's something you do, and then you move on and do other stuff. But Sangha understands it as the central Buddhist act. That's what he calls it, the central Buddhist act. And so over time, the refuges, the true refuges, the three jewels, they become more and more clear to us. And it's, to begin with, it takes a bit of sort of thinking about, doesn't it? What does it mean to go for refuge to the Dharma? What does it mean to go for refuge to the Buddha? Even to go for refuge to the Sangha, that's even harder to work out in some ways, I find. So Sangha, he coined one useful little list, I think. He talks about levels of going for refuge. He gives 5, how many is it? I think it's 5 different levels of going for refuge. I'm just going to talk about 3 of them. No, he gives 6 actually. I'll talk about 3 of them. So one of them he calls provisional. The provisional level of going for refuge. So this is where you come along to a Buddhist center and you come across meditation or Buddhism, whatever it is, and you find it's helpful. And you kind of import Buddhism into your life. It's like this becomes another component of your life. And we find that it helps us feel calmer and more loving and all the rest of it, whatever effect it has on us. We're trying it out, and it's like another component in our life. The thing is, it's a little bit like, this is a terrible example, which I want to find a better example, but I find it's a little bit like a Trojan horse. The Trojans kind of opened up the gates and brought in the Trojan horse because they thought it looked quite pretty or something. And the Dharma is a little bit like a Trojan horse. We sort of bring it within our life. We probably have, at the time, a fairly limited idea of what it could do and the kind of space it will take up in our life. But the thing is, the 3 jewels don't work like that. They start to displace or rearrange the mandala of our life. Especially the worst of the false refuges, if we're sincere, they will start to drift out of our life. I'll just read you a quote from Sangha. This is from the 10 Pillars of Buddhism, which is his book about practicing the precepts. So he says, when one places the Buddha, that is to say, places the spiritual ideal, at the center of one's personal mandala, a radical reorganization of the contents of that mandala naturally follows. If no such reorganization follows, then one's placing of the Buddha at the center of one's mandala has been purely nominal, or perhaps what one has placed there is not really the Buddha at all. The placing of the Buddha at the center of one's personal mandala corresponds to going for refuge. The radical reorganization of the contents of that mandala corresponds to the observance of the precepts as its natural consequence. Going for refuge, or commitment to the three jewels, is one's lifeblood as a Buddhist, he says. So he talks about a mandala. So this is all those different components of our life. And the components of our life are organized depending on the central values, the things that we hold most central, most dear. And if we start bringing the three jewels towards the center of our mandala, then that starts moving things around. So for myself, fairly soon after coming across Buddhism, I remember, I stopped drinking immediately. I was quite a heavy drinker. And I stopped drinking, and I slowly started moving away from all my drinking companions. It became very boring going out with them and staying sober, as I'm sure many of you have discovered yourself. And I remember taking more time with people who otherwise would have just been kind of completely two-dimensional objects in my life, sort of go to the library and start talking to the librarian and, talk to people in shops and so on. Suddenly people started taking on a kind of a fuller subjectivity to me. So those kinds of things started happening quite quickly. So that's the sort of provisional level of going for refuge as we bring it into our life and it starts to rearrange things. Then he talks about effective going for refuge. So this is where the three jewels are much more central in our life, and they've sort of reorganized the shape of our life, and we are more able and willing to practice the Dharma in more and more situations. It's no longer just something we do on a Wednesday night. It's something that we can apply in more and more areas of our life. One way in which I think we can feel this happening is when we start to realize that our sense of identity is no longer so conditioned. As I was talking about before, we can actually feel a sense of relief at dropping our ego projects, dropping the ways that we bolster up our rather limited sense of ourself. So we're not having to constantly improve ourselves by being a great conversationalist or doing all sorts of impressive things to impress other people, or we don't need to be anyone. It's a great relief when we realize we don't have to be someone. I wrote a book called Being No One, Going Nowhere, which I think is a great evocation of what this could be like. So in some ways, Buddhism is about becoming more and more. We're becoming more and more ethical and more kind and more aware. But in other ways, it's about becoming less, not more. So I've got a little quote here. This is from a Tibetan teacher, no longer alive, called Kalu Rinpoche. He says, "We live in illusion and the appearance of things. There is a reality. We are that reality. When you understand this, you see that you are nothing. And being nothing, you are everything. That is all. Being nothing, you are everything. So, yes, I had to prepare this talk rather quickly, and I didn't give myself very long, even given the amount of time I was, the amount of notice I had. And it was interesting for me to see my own process around that, my own insecurity around that. And I was less prepared than I'd like to be. But I did what I always do before I talk, before I deliver a talk or deliver some sort of event, which is very simply I light a stick of incense and I bow to the 3 jewels, and as far as I'm able, I hand it over to the refuges. It's like I get myself out of the way as best I can, and I just say, okay, it's over to you now. Do your worst. So that's what's coming. To whatever extent I can hand it over to the refuges, that's what I'm trying to do. So just on the technicality, the point of effective going for refuge is the point at which one is thought to be ready to be ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order. And what we're always trying to do in order to make going for refuge more effective is to make the refuges real, come to the point of real going for refuge, which is another level that Sangha talked about. So this is where we really have got the true refuges. We really know what the refuges are. It's no longer a kind of imaginative, semi-conceptual, semi-intuited sense of something we're fumbling for. We've actually met reality closely enough that we know what we're doing. We know what the refuges are. We can really relax at that point. We can stop the struggle. And our life at that point is really living the Dharma life. This is the point of no return. Up until then, of course, we can be living a Dharma life, and it's always a Dharma life in process. We're always a work in process. And just to say, the point beyond that is absolute going for refuge, which is when we become awakened. That's when we are a refuge. So I'll leave it there, and I'll just remind you of the title. I don't know if I even gave you the title. The title of this talk is Refuge Supreme is there for me. Refuge Supreme is there for me. And you might recognize those words because we chant in the Triratna Vandana, if you've recognized the Triratna Vandana, but also the last Vandana, which we chant at the end of each Sangha night. We chant the Pali for these words. We say, Buddhome Saranang Varang, which means something like, the Buddha is a true refuge for me, which Sangha has translated as Refuge Supreme is there for me. Dharma Saranang Varang, Sangha Saranang Varang. Saranang, refuge, Varang means true or supreme. So when we chant the last Vandana, hopefully you can give those words a bit of extra oomph. But until then, I shall wrap up at that point.